Today's program is going to be mainly about the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. I say attacks because it is now the absolutely accepted consensus, shared by everybody, including of course myself, that these were targeted sabotage attacks against the Nord Stream pipelines, certainly not accidents, certainly not the results of earthquakes or any of those things. Before I do that, however, I'm going to quickly do, as I traditionally do, a quick summary of the news from the Ukrainian battlefronts. Briefly, all is quiet on all the fronts, apart from the two that I've been talking about before, Bakhmut, where there's been more reports of more Russian advances, and Liman or Krasny Liman, where the Ukrainians are continuing their offensive. Now, yesterday, I discussed comments, suggestions by some Russian commentators that the Russians might be preparing some sort of operation in Liman to cut off and encircle a Ukrainian military group that had advanced perhaps very far, was vulnerable to attacks on its flanks, and might therefore be ripe for encirclement. Well, there's been no sign of anything like that over the last 24 hours. On the contrary, all the evidence is that at least on the Liman front, it is the Ukrainian military which slowly and gradually continues its attempts at advancing towards Liman, suffering apparently quite heavy losses in the process. And I'm starting to think that the Russian plan on the Liman front is not to destroy Ukrainian military formations there, not at this time, but rather a holding operation whilst the defences in Lugansk region, northern Lugansk region, which would have been the ultimate target of a Ukrainian offensive passing through Liman, to build up those defences in Lugansk region and basically wait this offensive out. In fact, it seems to me that what the Russians have basically been doing ever since Ukraine started its offensive, or if you prefer, various offensives, at the beginning of September, is essentially hunker down, allow Ukraine to gain ground in a few places, expend large amounts of military equipment and ammunition in doing so. There are some reports now that Ukraine has lost something like 60% of the tanks it was supplied by the Western powers, with shortages, with the West now finding it struggling to replace these tanks with Soviet models. In fact, Slovenia, one of the NATO countries, has now had to supply Ukraine with T-55 tanks from the 1950s. The T-55, by the way, is a tank whose origins were in a design which was completed in the 1940s. So we're talking about a pretty old tank, modernized in some respects, but still hardly a tank suitable for operation on the battlefields. And one also gets reports that Ukraine is again starting to run through its ammunition stocks. I've even seen one or two reports which suggest that HIMARS ammunition is now beginning to run low as well. And of course, there's also been reports that Ukraine is suffering heavy losses. Heavy losses, obviously, on the Kherson battlefields, which I've talked about in the past. Heavy losses in the Liman or Krasny Liman area. The Russian Ministry of Defense, by the way, in its latest report, also spoke about heavy Ukrainian losses in this area too. So I suspect this is the Russian plan. Hunker down, let Ukraine make a few ephemeral gains, lose vast amounts of ammunition, men, and machines in the process, setting up the situation after the autumn rains and the bog, which apparently is now expected in about 2 weeks' time, setting up the situation for the major Russian offensive which is to come when the ground starts to harden. And by the way, on that topic, there's been a lot of flesh-creeping talk, which I've been picking up in places like the Daily Telegraph, about a steady build-up of Russian armoured power on the border with Kharkiv region. And this is all coming, of course, from Ukrainian sources. So that seems to me to be, at the moment, the situation on the battlefields. I can discuss this in more detail, but I think, given that I want to focus today on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, I'm not going to. So let's now turn to these attacks on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. As I said, there's no doubt at all that these were attacks. These were actually planned, well-organized attacks. Now, why and who? Well, the why, I think, is not in itself difficult to understand. We can come to an obvious conclusion right from the first point, which is that, of course, whoever did launch these attacks on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 doesn't want gas flowing through these pipelines to Europe. Now, that, however, begs multiple other questions, because, as we're going to discuss in a moment, that does lead to interesting questions about who. Now, I think before we proceed further, a number of things about the technical challenge of launching this kind of attack on the pipelines needs to be addressed. First of all, as I've discussed in many programs, attacks on civilian infrastructure, far from being straightforward and easy as many people think, and as some thrillers imply, is actually extremely difficult. Undersea pipelines are going to be particularly difficult targets. They're going to be built to withstand enormous pressures, both from the gas within them and from the sea outside them. And of course, many of them are in deep waters, though it seems that some of these attacks, at least, were in relatively shallow waters, relatively shallow meaning around 80 to 90 meters. So, whoever carried out these attacks must have a great deal of expertise and ability to plant explosives in a way that can rupture massively over-engineered underwater pipelines. And that immediately points, or so it seems to me, to a major power, to a decision taken by a state. It's absolutely inconceivable that some kind of rogue actor, some kind of terrorist group or extremists or somebody of that kind could have done this by themselves. They wouldn't have the ability either to operate below the sea or to know how to plant these explosives or to possess explosives in the necessary quantities, and I suspect, though I'm not an explosives expert, to have the right sort of explosives that can be successfully used in this sort of operation. They'll also have to know quite a lot about the layout of the pipelines and also about the monitoring systems of these pipelines, which will presumably be extremely extensive. There will be lots of equipments, probably undersea cameras, vibration devices, sound devices, able to keep track of what's going on around the pipelines to make sure that the pipelines themselves are operating normally. This equipment would obviously be there, this partly to prevent interference with the pipelines, but also, I would have thought, to make sure that if there was a problem, a rupture somewhere or something like that, that the area where it had happened could be located quickly. So this is a very sophisticated operation, and one which could only have been carried out by a major power. Now, which one? Well, one country obviously has a massive interest in preventing gas passing through pipelines to Europe from Russia, and that country is Ukraine. So could Ukraine have done this? To be straightforward about it, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, Ukraine doesn't actually border the Baltic Sea. I think it'd been fairly difficult for them to get access to the Baltic Sea. And remember, this would be a complex operation. It would take time to carry out. You'd need both underwater and, I suspect, overseas craft. I think it would have been a very difficult operation for Ukraine to carry out. Bear in mind also that Ukraine has been launching lots of attacks on infrastructure. They've launched attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. This has now even been admitted in the New York Times. They've been also shelling repeatedly the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson region and the dam at Novaya Kakhovka. Also in Kherson region. And though they managed to do some damage to both of these bridges, they've not been able to destroy the structure of either of these bridges. Well, obviously, an undersea water attack is a different thing from shelling something. But to be frank, given that we are talking about an operation an order of magnitude more sophisticated than the attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge and the dam at Novaya Kakhovka, I can't really see that Ukraine can have been fully or directly involved. Maybe some Ukrainians were involved, maybe the Ukrainian government did participate in some way. We'll come to that in a moment. But if so, it must have done so in a strictly secondary capacity. And to be frank, I think even that unlikely. So, other possible culprits. Poland has often spoken about the wickedness of sending gas through pipelines from Russia to Ukraine. And as President Putin of Russia never ceases to remind us, the Poles have in effect stopped the Yamal pipeline from providing gas to Germany by redirecting its flow from Germany to Poland. So the Poles have a long-standing history of virulent objection to these pipelines. Do they have the capabilities to do this? I think the probable answer is yes. And I have to say, I do think there are some people in the Polish government who are probably capable of ordering this sort of thing. But having said that, it would still be an enormously complex operation for a country like Poland. And I can't help but think that if it were carried out by a country like Poland, a country which is on rocky terms with its two giant neighbours, Russia and Germany, I can't help but think that the Poles would be taking an extreme risk, and it would be something that would also probably have been detected. This looks to me like the work of a great power. Now, which great power? Well, it seems to me there's 4 countries in Europe that do have this capability. They have the military forces to do it. Russia, the United States, France, and Britain. Now, notice I'm not including Germany. I suspect the Germans again could carry this out, but for various reasons, I think it's most unlikely that they did. And I'm going to come to that again in a moment. So, which of these 4 powers might have done that? Well, I don't think it was France. It's too remote from this area. That's purely a guess, but I'm not going to spend any more time talking about France. Let's talk about the other three. Russia. Now, the Russians, at this moment in time, are not selling very much gas to Europe. They built Nord Stream 1 and they built Nord Stream 2. And Nord Stream 1 was very much a feather in their cap. It was something that sealed the economic relationship between Russia and Germany. And it was anticipated that Nord Stream 2 would take this a whole big step further. Why then would the Russians want to destroy these pipelines? Now, I have to say, I've seen various theories, but I can't really understand them. On the one hand, the Russians cannot be forced to send gas through these pipelines. So blowing up the pipelines doesn't mean that doesn't give the Russians some capability which they don't already have. They can simply switch off the tap at source and can do so at any time. And in fact, they've done so. So that doesn't seem to me to make much sense. It's perfectly true that gas levels from Russia to Europe have been significantly reduced. The Russians claim that this is all the product of misdeeds by the Western powers, their failure to sort out their sanctions, their inability to get the gas turbines operating for Nord Stream 1. And of course, it is indeed the case that Nord Stream 2, it was the German government that decided that they would suspend indefinitely its operation. So the Russians I think they have a reasonable argument that it's not they who are actually suspending gas flows to Europe. But I've always been a little cynical about these claims. I've always felt that Russia could, if it were minded to, probably find some ways to fix the problems with the turbines in Nord Stream 1 and continue to supply gas to Europe via Nord Stream 1. That's my own view. I know many disagree, but that's what I think the Russians could have done. Now, given that that is so, if I'm right about that, then you could just about cobble together some kind of rationale and say that maybe the Russians actually want to put the screws on the Europeans, and especially the Germans, even more by blowing up their own pipelines. But I have to say, I still find the logic of that extremely difficult, because surely if the Russians were withholding gas, they would be doing it in order to gain leverage. And that leverage would be to try to get the Germans to come to their senses and to discuss with the Russians some kind of an end to the sanctions war in order for gas to start to flow through the Nord Stream pipelines again. Blowing up the pipelines deprives the Russians of precisely that leverage. So that doesn't make any kind of sense to me, and I'm sure that this is wrong. I mean, I cannot see why the Russians would have done this thing. It seems to me so counterintuitive and so strange that I am going to discount this possibility. Now, I'm going to say that. I say that in the certain knowledge that when the investigations are concluded, in a couple of weeks' time, some people in Europe, perhaps all the governments in Europe, are going to blame the Russians. The Russians are always accused of doing strange, irrational, bizarre things that are completely counterproductive to themselves. And I'm going to make a further prediction. I think that we're going to start reading articles in the Western media which are going to tell us that the Russians are indeed irrational, illogical, slightly crazed people, because they blow up pipelines, which they partially own, by the way, contrary to their own interest. So the theory that the Russians blew up these pipelines is going to be used as evidence to prove an even wilder theory that the Russians are, to say it simply, mad. But I don't think the Russians are mad. I don't think President Putin is mad. And I don't personally believe the Russians would then have blown up these pipelines. So that leaves us with two parties, Britain and the United States. Now, I think Britain does have the capabilities to carry this out. And of course, the British have a long history of carrying out sabotage attacks and James Bond type attacks, which this kind of is, extending all the way back to the Second World War. So it would be in character. But I can't imagine that the British, however overexcited they might be about these kind of things, how much they might enjoy themselves doing these sort of things, I can't believe that they would have done this without consulting first with the United States. And there's a further reason why I think it's improbable that the British did this, and that is that doing this would potentially cause serious problems between Britain and Germany at a time when the British government seems to be keen to be on good terms with the current government in Germany. So it's possible it was the British. I don't think so. So that leaves, by a process of elimination, the United States. And of course, there's been lots of people coming forward and saying that the United States did do it. I've seen lots of people make that simple statement of claim, and they've assembled a fair amount of seemingly rather impressive evidence to suggest that it was the United States. For example, there is that comment President Biden made back in February that if Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States would make sure that Nord Stream 2 never came into operation. And many people think that this points to an intended sabotage operation against Nord Stream 2 and presumably Nord Stream 1 as well. And of course, there's also been the fact that the US Navy has been busy in the Baltic Sea recently. Now, I think the second point, actually, about the presence of the US Navy, for me at least, carries rather more traction than President Biden's comments made back in February, because I don't know that President Biden actually meant very much by them. But if we come back to the presence of the US Navy in the Baltic, and the fact that this operation, as it is a complex operation, probably one which I'm guessing would have taken several days to arrange, and which would have required both undersea and overseas craft, well, you would presumably want to have some degree of control over that area of the Baltic Sea. Now, the Baltic Sea isn't exactly a NATO lake. The Russians have a presence on it. St. Petersburg is there, is on the Baltic Sea. Kronstadt, a major Russian command post, is also on the Baltic Sea. The Russians also have naval forces in Kaliningrad. But it is a fact that overall and by and large, it is NATO nowadays, unlike the situation, by the way, in the Cold War, that has a predominant position, a preeminent position on the Baltic Sea. So that makes it easier, it seems to me, for the Western powers, specifically the US, to carry out this operation, rather than the Russians, who would be trying to carry out an operation like this in what might be potentially hostile waters. So I do think that the evidence points to the United States. I'm not going to say definitively in this program that it was the United States that carried out this attack. I say that because, as you will have noticed, this is all that I have set out here is essentially a chain of inference. And that can be useful in an investigation, but it's certainly not evidence, and of evidence at the moment we have very little. There's supposed to be an investigation going to be carried out. Apparently it has to wait 2 or 3 weeks for the turbulence of the sea as the gas escapes to die down, and only then will it be possible to carry out an investigation of these pipes and arrive at some tentative conclusion as to what happened and who might have been responsible. That investigation, of course, will be carried out by the Western powers. Gazprom has pointed out that it is a part owner of these pipelines and therefore has a right to participate in these investigations. If you think that's going to happen, then I have a bridge to sell you. So this will be a Western-controlled investigation, and I'm afraid because of that, I can only say that it's going to point inevitably towards one outcome, which is that the Russians were responsible. But anyway, we don't have actual evidence about who did it. Radek Sikorski, a former Polish foreign minister, has tweeted, "Thank you, USA," and some people have jumped on that and said that this man is connected to the CIA. He's married to Anne Applebaum, a well-known neoliberal a journalist in the United States, a person with a long history of hostility to Russia and the Putin government, and indeed to Germany as well. But I have to say that I don't know that Radek Sikorski is particularly well informed about these affairs, and I'd be astonished myself if anybody had actually told him before this operation was carried out that it was in fact who was going to carry this out. There's one other clue which is factual and which may point to the United States, which is that supposedly back in the summer, the CIA allegedly, this is according to the German media, tipped off the German government that some attack on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 was likely to take place. And that does imply a certain degree of foreknowledge. Now, I would have thought that if the US had that kind of information and was providing it to the Germans, and if that information clearly pointed to Moscow, then there would have been some follow-up diplomatically with the Russians. It seems to me that the fact that that didn't happen suggests that the US had pre-knowledge of these attacks, possibly because it was going to carry them out itself, and it was giving the Germans, in effect, notice that before very long, these pipelines would be out of order. I haven't mentioned one country, and that is Germany, and I think perhaps before I proceed further, I will explain why I don't think the German government itself is responsible. And that is simply this. For all the policies that the German government has been following since the Ukrainian crisis exploded in February, up to then and before then, Germany and Russia had a very close economic relationship indeed. I think that even Chancellor Scholz's government knows that if news were ever to leak out that the German government itself was sabotaging pipelines, bringing gas from Russia to Germany, the uproar in Germany would be so great that it would be inconceivable that the German government would survive. And I say that because, in fact, there have been growing protests in Germany about the energy shortages, which have included demands for the opening of Nord Stream 2. So I think it would be far too risky for the Germans themselves, the German government, to have carried this thing out. Politically, it would have been far too dangerous for the politicians in Berlin. And I don't think, to be straightforward about it, that they have that kind of commitment, that sort of fanatical commitment to this course that they've now undertaken from February, to be the sort of people who would carry out this kind of attack. So it seems to me that the Germans were given a tip-off by the Americans that Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 would be out of operation. But the fact that that tip-off was given by the Americans actually, for once, tends to point to the Americans themselves. Now, why would the United States do this? And here I'm going to say something. If the United States did do this, and I still use that word if, because there's always a distinction to be made between what I've said is a chain of inference and actual evidence. If the United States did do this, then what we're talking about is an exercise in pure nihilism. On the one hand, the United States has been opposed to all connections between gas connections, deals between Russia and Germany, going all the way back to the 1980s. It's opposed every single gas pipeline project with increasing vehemence. It clearly doesn't want Germany, its key European ally, to develop the kind of economic and commercial and energy links with Russia that Germany has been developing. And this campaign in the United States against Nord Stream 2, as we all know, it reached a crescendo in the last year of the Trump administration. Donald Trump and the administration started to impose sanctions against Nord Stream 2. In 2021, the US seemed to be rowing back up against those sanctions, but clearly opposition to Nord Stream 2 never really went away. And in fact, it has intensified and grown ever greater in over the last few months. So that tells us that the US has a long history of implacable opposition to attacks, to connections between economic connections between Germany and Russia, and especially energy connections between Germany and Russia. So if you like, that gives the US a very strong motive. It may have a further motive. Now, I've been discussing in recent programs the rumors that still circulate that there's some kind of peace deal in the works between the Russians and the Europeans over Ukraine, and that this is being brokered in some fashion, some formal fashion, by the Saudis. There was even a report yesterday, which has since been denied in Moscow, that the Russian and Ukrainian military leaderships were going to meet in Riyadh to try to find some way out of this conflict. Well, I want to stress again, I don't know how real these rumors are, whether there really are negotiations or discussions of that nature actually taking place. But what I will say is this: if they are, then that would be concerning from the United States. The United States, at least the current administration in the United States, remains, so it seems to me, implacably opposed to any negotiations between Russia and Europe leading to an end of the war, which might result in Russia retaining territory in Ukraine. So I think that this has been this has been a serious concern for the United States. Now, given that as part of any peace agreement, presumably these pipelines would be reopened, allowing gas to flow at a time when Europe is becoming increasingly short of gas, one can see that spiking the pipelines might be an effective way of wrecking these negotiations if they're really underway. So you can just about see motivations. In fact, if you have a paranoid and fevered personality, as I'm afraid some people in the United States nowadays appear to do, then you can see that there is actually a compelling reason why the United States might have carried out these sabotage attacks. And at this point, one could argue, and I think it would be a compelling case actually, that the United States had both the means, the presence in the Baltic Sea, and the motive to carry out this attack, and that therefore points to the United States. Well, I understand all that logic, and and that may very well be true. What I will say is this: once upon a time, not very long ago, I would have thought that the possibility of the United States carrying out attacks of this nature, sabotage attacks, on the energy infrastructure of one of its key allies, Germany, I would have said that was completely impossible. I mean, it is a policy of total nihilism. Now, the United States, once upon a time, worked to strengthen and build up its allies. It played a big role in the 1940s and 1950s in reviving and building up the German economy. It worked very hard to build up Germany, worked very hard to build up what eventually evolved into the European Union. It sought, in those days, strong allies, and it was concerned to maintain and preserve their prosperity, because the United States in those days realized that having strong allies made the United States geopolitically stronger, and having strong economic partners made the United States itself ultimately richer. If we now have a situation where the United States is blowing up the energy infrastructure of its own allies, causing them, in effect, to deindustrialize, to go into recession, trapping them into a situation where, in effect, their economy can only go downwards. Well, then all I can say is that this is a transformation of policy which only a paranoid country or a paranoid government would carry out. Weakening your own allies, blowing up the infrastructure of your own allies, weakens, in the end, your own alliance system. And if the truth of this, assuming the United States really was involved, if the truth of this were ever to come out, I mean, it would be bound to have a massive negative effect in Germany. So it would require, as I said, an extraordinary paranoid state of mind to do this. So much so, in fact, that once upon a time, I would have discounted the whole idea. Unfortunately, nowadays, I cannot do so. And I cannot do so especially with this administration that is now in office. It seems to me that ever since it gained office, this administration has been behaving in extremely reckless and dangerous ways. To give just a few examples, it has been, as I discussed in recent programs, sending messages to Moscow about use of nuclear weapons, which the Russians are almost certain to regard as threats, even and at the same time it is giving conflicting signals to China over Taiwan, with the President of the United States repeatedly saying, in a way that no doubt, I have no doubt, shows that this is his real intentions and beliefs, that the United States would defend Taiwan in the event of a war between Taiwan and China, with the President obviously knowing how dangerous that would be. So we've had a succession of extraordinary reckless moves. We've seen the United States under this administration taking extreme, provocative steps, which, to be frank, I cannot imagine any other administration previously taking. And this has all happened alongside a climate which, I'm going to say straightforwardly, looks to me to teeter on paranoia and hysteria about many issues, including many of the domestic issues in the United States itself. Far from a confident, strong government taking measured actions in the US interests, I almost get the sense sometimes of a government that veers between extremes of alarm and belligerence. So I cannot say that the United States didn't do this thing and that the administration would not have authorized it. The circumstantial facts, as I said, appear to point in that direction. They're only circumstantial, but I have to say, overall, they are alarmingly consistent with what we have seen before. Now, even saying that, of course, doesn't prove that it was the United States. I have difficulty, as I said, coming up with a coherent explanation why anyone else, the Russians specifically, would have done this sort of thing. I mean, I don't understand why the Russians would blow up their own pipelines in this manner. Nobody has come up with any kind of theory that I can see that makes any sort of sense. But I will wait and see what the investigation, when it happens, does come up with. Even a flawed and skewed and very biased investigation can sometimes disclose details which can be suggestive and can point in particular directions which the investigators themselves perhaps might not wish to go. So I'm going to leave it at that at the moment. I'm going to say simply this. I can't understand why the Russians would have done this thing. I can see that the US might have had the motive and the means, but that isn't evidence. However, I also have to say that if this operation was undertaken by the United States, it would be consistent with the actions of the current administration. Perhaps others were involved, perhaps Ukraine was involved, perhaps Britain was involved, and the British, of course, as I said, do have a history of getting involved in all sorts of wild and extraordinary activities like this. But what I will say is this: if it was the United States, then a major line has been crossed. We are looking, in that case, into a world of recklessness and irresponsible and dangerous behavior from an administration which, from this point on, or so it seems to me, can only get still more dangerous. And that is an alarming and frightening thing, and it would be the most alarming and frightening thing of all that has come through out of this conflict. Anyway, on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, I'm going to leave it at that. There's two further things I want to say. Firstly, it seems to me that after its initial teething problems, inevitable, and as I said, on an operation of this scale, Russia's mobilization process is now well underway, and the expectations are that we'll be starting to see its visible effects on the Ukrainian battlefields sometime around the end of October. So that's one thing to say. The second is that the Russians have provided us now with a more formal timeline of events following the referendums. Now, the referendums were concluded yesterday. The word is that the Kremlin is pleased with the way the referendums went. Turnout was high, and it does seem to have been generally high, at least in Donbass. Ukrainian attempts to interfere with these referendums seem to have been unsuccessful, and over the next few days and hours, we will probably see formal applications sent to Russia for the inclusion of these territories, these four regions, into Russia itself. Now, the Russians, there were some suggestions that the Russians would call an extraordinary meeting of their parliament, the Federal Assembly, either today or tomorrow, to rubber stamp the inclusion of these regions into Russia. And it was also suggested that President Putin would address the Federal Assembly tomorrow when he would agree to the inclusion of these four territories into Russia. Well, we've now been given rather more structured dates. The Speaker of the upper house of the Russian Parliament, the Federation Council, Valentina Matviyenko, I should say that it's the upper house, the Federation Council, that here makes the key decision. She said that the decision will probably happen, that the Federation Council is unlikely to meet before the 4th of October. And the Duma, the lower house, is likely to meet on the 3rd of October. So it looks like Monday and Tuesday of next week, rather than this week, with a final decision possibly made on Tuesday or Wednesday. Now, some people are trying to read implications into all of this. I think that there's been some suggestions that these decisions have been put back, perhaps to allow space for diplomatic activity or something of that kind. Frankly, I don't think so. And in connection with suggestions that the Russians delayed these decisions because of the attacks on the pipelines, and the pipeline attacks have made them nervous in some fashion, I'm going to say straight out that doesn't seem to me at all likely, because I recall reading Matviyenko, I recall reading on TASS comments by Matviyenko saying that the meeting of the Federation Council would be on the 4th of October, and that she said this before news of those pipeline attacks trickled through. So I don't think that these two events are connected in any way. I think that the reason that this has happened in this way is that the Russians don't want to look hurried as they make these decisions. And I think that's an understandable decision. I think that they feel that if they pressed ahead and made these decisions immediately, it might suggest that there's some reasons, that there's some concerns, and I think about the situation on the battlefronts, for example, and I think the Russians are keen to avoid giving that impression. So one way or the other, I expect that by the middle of next week, these 4 regions will be recognized as by Russia as part of its own territory. Now, as to the significance of that, I'm going to also suggest that shortly after that, we will have the formal announcement from the Kremlin and the Defense Ministry that the military operation in Ukraine has been upgraded to the counter-terrorist operation which we've been hearing about. Now, that's the situation in and around Ukraine. Something else very significant has happened over the last 24 hours, even though only Zero Hedge, as far as I can see, is reporting it in that way. And that is that the Bank of England has now been forced to return to the gilt market, that's the British government's bonds, and is starting to buy British government bonds again. In other words, even as it is raising interest rates, the Bank of England is once again engaging in a form of quantitative easing. Now, I have to say that is an astonishing development, and it does make me wonder whether we're going to start to see other central banks before long doing the same thing. The obvious one to start would be the European Central Bank, which must be increasingly concerned about the effect of monetary tightening on the Mediterranean economies, Italy, Greece, and all the others, and which might therefore be tempted to start to resume bond buying. All I would say about that is that a situation where central banks are simultaneously raising interest rates and engaging in quantitative easing, in other words, money creation, seems to me beyond bizarre. But that is where we are. Now, another thing has happened, and this derives from an article which I haven't actually seen and read, which is in the Wall Street Journal, but which others, I've seen others reference, which is that supposedly no country has agreed, none of the big oil importers, India, China, Turkey, wherever, have agreed to the G7 price cap idea on Russian oil. And that has apparently led to a decision by the Biden administration to signal that secondary sanctions on trading in Russian oil is not something that the United States is intending. Now, if that is true, then it seems to me that that is in effect an admission that the oil price cap idea has failed. Well, I only mentioned that in passing. I'm not entirely sure that this is correct. It didn't seem to me to be that this story in the Wall Street Journal didn't seem to be particularly well sourced, but I will certainly look out for it. One way or the other, though, I suspect that that is what is going to happen. Anyway, an extraordinary 24 hours, and a time when, as I said, things starting to look very serious in globally speaking. I think that these attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline have now brought this crisis to levels that we have never before seen. We are very close, we're coming very dangerously close to a Cuban Missile Crisis moment, except, of course, that there is no JFK in the White House. And at that point, I'm going to end this program and wish you all a good day. Please remember that you can find us all on our other platforms, especially Locals and Rumble, Odyssey and BitChute, as well as Telegram. And please remember that you can find me on Locals every Wednesday, including this Wednesday, at 1400 hours, Eastern Standard Time, when I do my live streams on Locals, which are exclusive to Locals. And you can also support us, if you wish, through Patreon and Subscribestar, by going to our shop and finding all the great things that we have there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all those other amazing things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me on this momentous day. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.